The sky darkened with ominous clouds over the outskirts of Seattle, Washington. The air was thick and humid, warning of an impending storm. By mid-afternoon, the rain began to fall, a torrential downpour that seemed determined to drown the world beneath it. On a desolate country road, two small figures trudged through the mud. Ethan, a wiry 12-year-old with determined eyes, gritted his teeth as he hoisted a large sack of recyclables over his shoulder. The bag was almost as tall as he was, sagging under its weight. With his free hand, he held tightly onto his little sister, Sophie. At 5 years old, Sophie's tiny frame was drenched, her curls plastered to her pale face. She shivered. Her sobs nearly drowned out by the roar of the storm. "Ethan," Sophie whimpered, her voice trembling. "I'm so cold. I'm so hungry." Ethan tightened his grip on her hand, his resolve hardening. "I know, Soph. Just a little further. There's got to be somewhere we can stay dry." In truth, Ethan had no idea where they were headed. He had promised Sophie a safe place, but the storm was relentless, and the streets offered no shelter. Their mother had left them 2 years ago, and since then, survival had been Ethan's only focus. He had learned to sift through trash for recyclables to trade for a few dollars, had slept under bridges and in abandoned sheds, and had grown used to the cold stares of strangers who treated him like he was invisible or worse. A nuisance, but Sophie was different. She still had hope, a childlike belief that things could get better. Ethan clung to that hope for her sake, even when his own had long since faded. The rain intensified, soaking them to the bone. Sophie's shivers turned to coughs, small and weak but alarming enough to spur Ethan into action. He scanned the horizon and spotted a large house in the distance, its windows glowing with warm light. The sight of it made his heart ache, such comfort and warmth felt impossibly out of reach. Still, it was their only option. "Come on, Soph," Ethan said, adjusting the sack on his back. "We're going to ask for help." Sophie nodded, her steps faltering but obedient. They reached the towering iron gate that surrounded the house, its ornate black bars glistening with rain. Ethan set down his sack, took a deep breath, and pressed the button beside the gate. A buzzer echoed faintly, but there was no response. Ethan's heart sank, but he refused to give up. He glanced at Sophie, who stood beside him with wide, trusting eyes, and felt a surge of determination. Pulling the gate slightly ajar, thankfully unlocked, he led Sophie up the winding path to the front door. The house loomed over them, its grandeur both intimidating and awe-inspiring. Ethan hesitated, his hand hovering over the heavy wooden door, before knocking 3 times. The sound echoed loudly in the storm's silence. And a few tense moments later, the door creaked open. A man in his late 40s stood in the doorway, his sharp features illuminated by the warm light behind him. He looked down at the 2 drenched children with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and gruff. "Sir," Ethan said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "We just need a place to wait out the storm. My sister is sick, and it's freezing out here." The man frowned, his piercing gaze scanning them from head to toe. "I don't usually let strangers in." "Please," Ethan said, desperation creeping into his tone. "We won't cause any trouble. Just a little while, until the rain stops." Sophie coughed softly, and the sound seemed to soften the man's expression. With a heavy sigh, he stepped aside. "Come in." Ethan and Sophie entered the house cautiously, their wet clothes leaving puddles on the polished wood floor. The warmth hit them instantly, and Ethan couldn't help but glance around. The space was immaculate, gleaming floors, plush furniture, and walls adorned with expensive art. It was a world away from anything they had ever known. "Wait here," the man said, disappearing into another room. Ethan turned to Sophie, crouching to rub her arms for warmth. "See, Soph. I told you we'd find somewhere safe." Before Sophie could reply, Ethan's eyes landed on a photograph displayed on a nearby table. The image was of a woman, her kind smile radiating through the glass. Something about her face tugged at his memory, a vague, distant familiarity that he couldn't place. The man returned with 2 towels, his expression unreadable. "Dry yourselves off," he said, handing them over. "And don't touch anything." Ethan nodded, taking the towel gratefully. But as he dried Sophie's hair, he couldn't stop staring at the photo. His voice was barely a whisper when he spoke. "Who is she?" Ethan asked, pointing to the picture. The man's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. "Why do you ask?" Ethan hesitated, then said, I think I've seen her before." The man's face paled, his breath hitching. "That's impossible," he said sharply. She passed away." But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling. The woman in the photo, her face, her smile, was etched into his memory. He looked up at the man, his voice trembling. "Her name, was it Emily?" The man froze, the color draining from his face. "How do you know that name?" he demanded. Ethan stammered, unsure of how to explain. She helped me and Sophie once, a long time ago. I can't forget her face. She gave us food and water when we had nothing." The room fell silent, the weight of Ethan's words pressing down like the storm outside. The man stared at him, a mix of disbelief and something else, hope. "Pain. Tell me everything," the man said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan hesitated, glancing at Sophie, who clung to his side with wide, curious eyes. The man's intense gaze made him nervous, but something about the question, about the way the man's voice trembled, compelled him to answer. "It was 2 years ago," Ethan began, his voice quiet but steady. "Sophie and I were living near a landfill on the edge of the city. We hadn't eaten in days. I was so weak, I couldn't even stand anymore." Sophie looked up at Ethan, her small hand gripping his. "I remember," she said softly. "I was scared." Ethan nodded, squeezing her hand for reassurance. "Then, she came. A woman with a kind smile and sad eyes. She knelt down next to me and gave us food and water. She even wiped my face with a warm cloth." He paused, his eyes distant as he recalled the moment. "She told me to stay strong, to keep Sophie safe." The man's expression shifted, the hardness in his features melting into something raw and vulnerable. "And you're sure it was her, Emily?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan pointed to the photograph on the table. "I'm sure. I'd never forget her face." The man, Henry, lowered himself onto the nearby couch, his hands trembling as he rubbed his temples. The name Emily escaped his lips like a prayer, filled with a mixture of reverence and sorrow. He looked at Ethan and Sophie again, studying them as though searching for pieces of a puzzle. "I don't understand," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "Emily, she was my wife. She passed away a year ago." Ethan's stomach tightened. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to upset you." Henry shook his head, standing abruptly. He paced the room, his hands clenched into fists. No. It's just, she never told me about you. About anyone she might have helped." He stopped and turned, his gaze piercing. "What else did she say to you?" Ethan thought for a moment, then spoke carefully. "She said if we ever met a man named Henry, we should tell him, she's sorry. And that she loved you very much." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Henry staggered, his knees buckling as he sank back onto the couch. Tears filled his eyes, spilling over as he buried his face in his hands. Ethan and Sophie exchanged a nervous glance. They hadn't meant to stir such strong emotions, but it was clear their presence and their story had unearthed something deeply personal. Henry finally looked up, his face etched with grief and a flicker of hope. "She was always carrying the weight of something," he said, his voice trembling. "She used to disappear for hours, sometimes days, saying she needed time to think. I never pressed her about it. I thought it was just her way of coping with her own pain." He took a deep breath. Then asked, Do you remember anything else? Anything about why she might have been near the landfill? Ethan shook his head. No, sir. She didn't say much. Just that she wanted to help. Henry's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, the room was silent except for the steady patter of rain against the windows. Then, as if resolving himself, Henry straightened. You said you've been living on the streets since then? He asked. Yes, Ethan replied cautiously. It's been hard, but I've tried to take care of Sophie. Henry nodded, his expression softening. You've done well. More than most could in your situation. Ethan frowned, unsure of where this was leading. Why are you asking? Henry stood, his movements purposeful. Because I owe you something. If Emily helped you, if she cared enough to tell you those things, then you're part of a story I need to understand. And you need more than what you've been given. Sophie tugged on Ethan's sleeve, her voice small but hopeful. Does that mean we can stay? Henry crouched to her level, his eyes meeting hers. Yes, he said gently. You're safe here. Both of you. Henry insisted that Ethan and Sophie stay in his home, at least for the night. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, the warmth and safety of the house began to ease their tension. Henry prepared a modest meal, which Ethan and Sophie devoured with a hunger that made Henry's chest ache. That night, as the children slept in the guest room, Henry sat alone in his study. He stared at the photograph of Emily on his desk, the words Ethan had spoken replaying in his mind. There was more to her story than he had ever known, and the thought both terrified and intrigued him. He picked up his phone and made a call. Quinn, he said, addressing his trusted assistant. I need you to look into something. 2 children, a boy and a girl. They've been living on the streets for 2 years. Start with shelters and social services, anything that can connect them to Emily. Yes, sir, Quinn replied without hesitation. I'll start immediately. As Henry ended the call, he looked out the window. The rain streaking the glass. Emily, he whispered. What were you trying to tell me? The morning arrived with clear skies, as though the storm had washed away not just the rain but the heaviness of the past night. Ethan woke first, his instincts honed by years of survival urging him to check on Sophie. She was still asleep, curled up under the softest blanket she'd ever known, her tiny hands clutching the fabric as though afraid it might vanish. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a strange sense of calm. Yet, beneath it, unease stirred. Why had Henry been so affected by their story? And what did it mean that Emily, the woman who had saved them, was his wife? Ethan tiptoed out of the room. His bare feet silent on the wooden floors. He found Henry in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a stack of papers. Henry looked up as Ethan entered, gesturing for him to sit. I had my assistant do some digging, Henry said without preamble. I hope you don't mind. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. What did you find? Henry slid a photograph across the table. It was an old picture of Emily, smiling brightly as she knelt beside 2 young children. One of them was unmistakably Ethan. This was taken about 2 years ago, Henry explained. Not long before she passed. It was found on her phone, but she never told me about it. Ethan's throat tightened as he stared at the image. That's us, he whispered. She saved us. Henry nodded, his expression heavy with emotion. Emily worked quietly, helping people who had fallen through the cracks. I always admired her compassion, but now I realize how much she kept from me. It wasn't just charity for her, it was personal. Why would she keep it a secret? Ethan asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Henry sighed, running a hand through his hair. Emily carried a lot of guilt. She lost a child years before we met, a miscarriage. She never spoke about it much, but I think helping kids like you was her way of coping. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the weight of Henry's words settling over him. She was kind. She didn't just give us food, she made us feel like we mattered. Henry's eyes glistened. You did matter to her. That's why I want to help you now. Ethan stiffened. We don't need charity. It's not charity, Henry said firmly. It's a promise. To Emily. To you. Before Ethan could respond, Sophie shuffled into the room, rubbing her eyes. Good morning, she mumbled, climbing into Ethan's lap. Henry smiled warmly. Good morning, Sophie. Did you sleep well? She nodded, her curls bouncing. Yes. Your house is so warm. Henry chuckled, then grew serious. Would you two be okay if I asked you a few more questions? I need to understand everything. Ethan exchanged a glance with Sophie, then nodded. Okay. Henry listened intently as Ethan recounted the years they had spent on the streets, the hardships they had endured, and the fleeting moments of kindness from strangers like Emily. By the time Ethan finished, Henry's expression had darkened, his jaw tight. You've been through more than anyone should, Henry said, his voice filled with resolve. But I promise, you won't have to do it alone anymore. That afternoon, as Henry prepared to take Ethan and Sophie to a nearby clinic for a checkup, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. Henry's assistant, Quinn, stepped out, his face grim. Sir, Quinn said, handing Henry a file. I found something you need to see. Henry opened the file, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock. Inside were documents detailing Sophie and Ethan's time in foster care and their eventual escape from an abusive home. They were placed in a foster home 2 years ago, Quinn explained. But the reports indicate severe neglect and mistreatment. Ethan took Sophie and ran, and they've been on the streets ever since. Henry clenched the file, his anger barely contained. No child should go through this. Quinn hesitated, then added, there's more. The foster family is still listed as their legal guardians. If anyone discovers their whereabouts, they could be forced back. Ethan, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. No, he said sharply. We're not going back. Ever. Henry knelt to meet Ethan's gaze. You won't, he said firmly. I'll make sure of it. Later that night, Henry called in favors, contacting lawyers and child welfare advocates. His connections and resources worked in his favor, but the process would take time. As the legal battle began, Ethan and Sophie remained under Henry's protection, growing closer to him with each passing day, but danger loomed. One evening, as they returned from a trip to the clinic, Henry's car was followed by a vehicle with tinted windows. It trailed them for miles before speeding off into the night. They know, Henry said grimly as he tightened the estate's security measures. But they won't take you. Not while I'm here. The following days were tense. Henry's estate buzzed with activity as lawyers prepared documents to sever Ethan and Sophie's ties to their former foster family. Security guards patrolled the property day and night, and Quinn worked tirelessly to uncover any potential threats. Ethan, though grateful for the protection, felt restless. He spent hours sitting by the large window in the guest room, watching Sophie play in the garden below. She laughed and ran with a freedom she hadn't known in years, but Ethan's mind was elsewhere. Why are you so quiet? Sophie asked one afternoon, climbing into the chair beside him. Ethan hesitated, then sighed. I'm just thinking, Soph. About everything. About what happens next. Sophie tilted her head. What do you mean? I mean, what if this doesn't work? Ethan said, his voice low. What if we have to leave again? Sophie frowned, then placed her small hand over his. Henry won't let that happen. He promised. Ethan didn't respond, but Sophie's words lingered. For the first time in years, they weren't running. They weren't hungry. They weren't alone. Could he really trust that it would last? That night, as the house settled into an uneasy silence, the tension finally broke. Security alarms blared, waking everyone inside. Henry rushed to Ethan and Sophie's room, pulling them close as guards moved swiftly through the house. What's happening? Ethan asked, his heart pounding. Stay with me, Henry said, his voice calm but firm. The source of the disturbance became clear moments later. 2 figures had been spotted trying to scale the estate's walls. They were apprehended quickly, but the incident left everyone shaken. Henry gathered Ethan and Sophie in the study, his expression grim. "It's time to end this," he said. "I've been trying to protect you quietly, but these people won't stop. We need to take this fight to them." Ethan sat up straighter, his jaw set. "What can I do to help?" Henry smiled faintly, impressed by Ethan's determination. "You've already done more than enough. Now, it's my turn." Over the next week, Henry's legal team worked relentlessly. The foster family's history of abuse was exposed, and Ethan and Sophie's status as runaways was redefined as an act of survival. Through Henry's influence, the court granted him temporary guardianship while the case progressed. The moment the judge's decision was announced, Henry returned to the estate with a mixture of triumph and relief. He found Ethan and Sophie in the garden, where they were helping the groundskeeper plant flowers. "Ethan. Sophie," Henry called, his voice filled with emotion. They turned, their hands dirty with soil but their faces lit with curiosity. "It's over," Henry said, kneeling to their level. "The court has granted me guardianship. You're safe now. You'll never have to go back." For a moment, Ethan just stared, his mind struggling to process the words. Then, tears welled in his eyes, and he threw his arms around Henry. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you for everything." Sophie joined the embrace, her laughter mingling with tears. "We have a home now," she exclaimed. Henry held them tightly, his own tears falling freely. "Yes, you do," he said. "And this is just the beginning." In the months that followed, life transformed for Ethan and Sophie. Ethan enrolled in school for the first time in years, excelling in his studies despite the challenges of catching up. Sophie flourished, her playful spirit brightening the estate. Henry, once consumed by grief and loneliness, found new purpose in being their guardian. One evening, as the 3 of them sat in the garden beneath the setting sun, Ethan spoke. "Henry." "Yes," Henry replied, glancing at him. "Do you think Emily would be proud of us?" Ethan asked, his voice tentative. Henry's gaze softened. "More than you can imagine," he said. "You were her last act of kindness, her way of leaving the world a little better. And now, we get to carry that forward." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in years, he felt whole, a part of something bigger than himself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan took Sophie's hand and looked at Henry with a small, determined smile. "We'll make her proud. Together." And in the warm glow of the evening, their new family stood as a testament to love, resilience, and the enduring power of kindness.